So I'm Tanya Howard, a research fellow with the Invasive Animals Cooperative Research Centre, coming out of the University of New England in New South Wales. And today I'm presenting, as Belinda said, a talk that was developed for the Australasian Wildlife Management Conference in 2015, just this week in Perth. We wanted to come over and share these presentations with Department of Ag because we are working on a collaborative research project, and it just gives you some idea of the kind of work that is coming out of the Invasive Animals CRC, hopefully trigger some ideas about how we can collaborate going forward. So today I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors on this presentation, which are Petra Scowen from the Queensland Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, and Lyndall Joy Thompson, who was a previous research fellow in the Invasive Animals CRC. They actually collected the data that I'm talking about today, so I'm presenting on their behalf on this material. So facilitating effective community action is a research program that's funded by the Invasive Animals Cooperative Research Centre, and as I said, it's led by the University of New England in New South Wales. The research is concerned with the human dimensions of invasive species management, and the research is also guided by principles of working with and for communities, individuals and organisations. So in practice, this means that we work with stakeholders to identify research questions, and we partner for capacity building and knowledge sharing. So today I'll be presenting some findings from case studies about wild dog management, including an investigation with our research partner in Queensland, Biosecurity Queensland. The focus of this research has been on listening to community voices to explore the issue of wild dog management. Some examples of the kind of conversations we've been having, some quotes there on the screen, which I'll leave you to read for yourselves. But these quotes are all touching on different aspects of wild dog management and I suppose highlight some of the complex dynamics that we see out there for people trying to control this difficult problem. We've been having in-depth conversations with landholders and other key players across Australia. These conversations give us access to the way that individuals think about wild dogs, community engagement and collective action, which are all parts of our research interests. This data provides insights to the powerful stories that we all tell to make sense of difficult, ongoing and complex land management issues. So as part of this wild dog investigation, we went back to basics and asked, well, with wild dog management, what is the problem that we're looking at? There's a strong message about the best practice approach to wild dog management in Australia. This message is focused on the importance of collective action. The success of this approach relies on almost 100% participation from landholders. And while there are some examples of success, generally, the objective of complete participation is held up as a kind of holy grail. So our research was initially focused on understanding motivations for participation and on the problem of non-participation in collective action. As the research progressed, though, we began to see that the way we were framing the problem might be blinkering us from some important knowledge about landholder decision-making. So, as I said at the start, we've been talking to people. We've conducted in-depth interviews with a range of individuals across Australia. This is qualitative research. It's using social science to do the investigation. And the interest was really in complementing other investigations into wild dog management by other key organisations like ABARES and Australian Wool Innovation and various state governments. This data then enables us to drill into the individual perspectives that influence wild dog management in practice. So here's just some results, just quickly touch on these. One of the most interesting things that emerged from these interviews was really around the problem of ownership of wild dogs. So the mobility of wild dogs in the landscape is a serious issue, as you know, not only logistically for successful control, but also for landholders' acceptance of responsibility. There was a real question around control and whose dogs they actually were, particularly in relation to different land tenures. So looking at the common complaint about the neighbouring properties and particularly conservation reserves around who owned those dogs and who should control them. One of the other interesting outcomes of this research was that we found that impact on your agricultural productivity is often used, I suppose, to frame most of the messages around action, but that by framing these calls for action solely around production impacts, biodiversity, conservation and other things like good neighbour sort of values might be being missed, and they could be other messages that we really need to use to capture the attention of landholders and motivate action, particularly in diverse agricultural landscapes where people have got different enterprises and different land uses. We also saw that history and context is really important to understand in any efforts to get collective action happening, because collective action really requires more than coordination and facilitation, which that is really important, but it also requires that there's a fairly honest understanding of pre-existing tensions in the community, conflicts that might be there, and also previous versions of invasive species management through policy or legislation or even funding. These dynamics are all held in people's memories and can have a lot of impact on what they're prepared to do in collaboration with others. And we're also interested in whether we should spend our time focusing on developing stricter rules around community action and responsibility to control wild dogs, or whether we could rely on community norms and sort of social pressure, or whether we need a combination of both. And this final point is really crucial in invasive species management across all different species. We need to ask what is the best investment of our limited financial and human resources in achieving increased collective action. And again, understanding the real world context is really necessary here. If enforcement and compliance is not adequately resourced or undertaken, then creating more rules is unlikely to make much difference to the underlying human dimensions of the problem. In this situation, working with community members to develop and support social pressure through normalising certain behaviours is likely to create a longer lasting and more sustained change. I'll just now go into a little bit more detail around the specific investigation that happened in Queensland in partnership with the department there. This investigation took place in one local government area of central western Queensland, the Maranoa Shire. There's a little picture of it there. This shire is very diverse in terms of land use. There's sheep, cattle, mining, cropping, and I presume also there'd be a bit of hobby farming there. Not all landholders are involved in coordinated baiting, and the most common reason that was given for this lack of involvement was because they perceive that they're unaffected by the problem of wild dogs. However, what was most interesting in this data set was that we found that not belonging to the wild management group or participating in coordinated control didn't actually mean that landholders weren't doing anything to control their wild dog problem. Many individuals were acting as individuals, trapping, shooting, and so on, particularly if they had a direct impact or they were anticipating that there was an impact and that their assessment of their risk was motivating them. We also saw that there was a real grassroots resurgence of landholder interest in fencing, again at an individual property level, and in some cases through cluster fencing, with a few different landholders getting together and financing that themselves. But what we really saw was that using the simple metric of participation or non-participation in organised collective action really wouldn't have given us the whole picture of wild dog control in the region. And it was really by asking, listening to people's stories, that we found that people were still involved in wild dog management. So because we're doing collaborative research, and part of this is to work with our partners on what might be of interest to them, I thought it was useful to sort of show, I suppose, the pros and cons of going out and doing this kind of work, talking to people in depth. There's lots of benefits to this. It allows us to hear individual voices that might be lost in larger data sets, and it exposes us to surprising insights that can challenge our assumed knowledge of the issue. It can also provide a window into the darker side of seemingly straightforward processes and procedures, and I think this is particularly important when we're dealing with big organisational change, with legislation and with policy. We're looking at what the dark side of those might be when you're trying to implement those on the ground. In a one-on-one conversation, people are more likely to reveal sort of the complex reasons behind their participation or their non-participation in wild dog management. There are some sort of downsides to collecting data like that as well, and I've listed those there on the right hand of the table. The most important thing is really to know why you'd collect this information and what you're going to do with it. I'll just finish up with a few points from Queensland, from the Queensland case, and these are the learnings that our partners there particularly highlighted from being involved in this collaboration. Listening to landholder stories about their experiences with wild dogs challenged some existing assumptions in the department about what might be best practice. In particular, ideas about participation in coordinated baiting and non-participation, as I said before, and also raise questions about the appropriateness of a particular model of wild dog control in different landscapes, whether it was going to work in diverse landscapes. It was also useful for then taking this data and then using that to design a quantitative survey questions, because they were then informed by first-hand experiences and knowledge that was from that specific area, that jurisdiction, rather than relying on secondary sources or pre-existing survey questions that were taken from somewhere else. This data then formed the basis for a behavioural science project that's currently being conducted in the region, and you'll hear about that in a couple of presentations from my colleague Patty, please. We'll talk about that. So for us as invasive animals CRC researchers, I just wanted to flag that here in Western Australia we're currently partnering with the DAFWA Transforming Regional Biosecurity Response Project. We've also got a link with Trish Fleming and Tracy Moore at Murdoch University who are researching wild dog management. And we're hoping to work collaboratively to understand the impact of changes to community engagement and biosecurity management that have been ushered in by the Biosecurity Administration and Management Act, particularly this year as it's being implemented with group development of registered biosecurity groups. And that's my final slide. I just wanted to draw to your attention that one of the things I do as part of my role with the Invasive Animal CRC is I administer a Facebook group. It's a closed group that's focused on leadership in community engagement, particularly around invasive species management. And it's a community of practice is what we call it. So we try to use that as a forum to share resources. If you're interested in joining, you can email me. My email's there at the bottom of the page. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Lynette McLeod. I'm a PhD student at the University of New England in Armidale, and I'm also supported by the Invasive Animal CRC. My supervisors are Professor Don Hine from the university and Dr. Andrew Bengson from New South Wales DPI. Today I'm going to just talk about applying human behavioural science for more effective management outcomes. This will be just a fairly general talk, but I'll be illustrating some of the points from my research that I'm doing. So the first question, Management, what is it? It's a series of continuing and related activities to achieve, define goals or objectives by working with and through people. So people are an integral part of management programs. Tanya's just been talking about working with people, with communities. I'm going to focus on working through people. And because it's the individual's actions that determine whether management succeeds or fails. So what steps can we take to ensure that people's actions are consistent with what our management outcomes want to be? And the process of promoting certain actions I'm going to refer to as an intervention. You might sort of know them as different terms like extension or campaigns, but for this talk I'll be referring to them as interventions. Now interventions, there are about 8 or 9 different functions of an intervention. The function can be to educate people, to increase their awareness and understanding. It could be to persuade them, so you use try to induce some sort of feelings to get them to stimulate for action. A good example of that is the common using a fear appeal. We're all going to die if you don't do the particular action. There's the good old incentives, so creating some sort of expectation of reward. There's coercion and restriction. That's just using legislation or rules to influence people. They have some expectation of it's going to be punished or cost if they don't comply. We do training, which is just imparting skills. There's modelling, so that's just providing an example, sort of like a demonstration site, so people can aspire or imitate it. There's environmental restructuring, and this could be either physical, it could be something like just building a fence, or it could be social, like declaring an animal a pest is creating a social problem so that people in that sort of context, so people know that it's sort of a good thing to do to control it. And then there's also enablement, which is to enhance the means or reduce barriers. So that's just things like creating new technology, creating new methods of doing things. And I just want to point out these different types of functions, there are a different set of techniques used in each to achieve their outcomes. And also they're not used in isolation. A very effective intervention will use a combination of these different functions. And I mean, an obvious one is you'd never introduce a new legislation if you didn't try and educate people at first. So education is an important component for a lot of those other functions, just to increase awareness and understanding. But education by itself is not a very good way to actually change behaviour. You can change people's attitudes, and that's on the first step of changing behaviour, but by itself, education is usually not a very efficient way to change behaviour, effective way. And that's what effectiveness of interventions is linked to behaviour change. And so that it's all linked to human behaviour is very complex, and there's a vast number of factors that influence human behaviour. And to make sense of all this, it's easy to group these factors into 3 main groups. So those that affect people's capability of doing the behaviour. So that's their awareness, their know-how, physical and cognitive or personal skills. So these can be either physical, they're sort of an individual thing. They can be physical or they can be psychological. Then there's the second group of factors, which are the circumstances which you're in. So these can be physical circumstances or the social, sort of the context that you're trying to do these behaviours. So these tend to be more external to the individual. And then the last group are those that motivate people. These are again internal to the individual, but they can operate on a cognitive or reflective, so you're actually thinking about it, or they can operate on an automatics thing. It's unconscious. You're not aware that these things are actually influencing how you behave. And there's a huge, so how can we use this information? There's a huge knowledge base out there that's been involved in other fields, especially health and the environment. And they've worked out what the most effective techniques are to use to deal with each of these factors. So when we're designing an intervention, if we know what it is that's influencing the behaviour, then we can design a more effective intervention. So what are the steps to designing a successful intervention? I'm just going to give a very broad overview. There are a lot of frameworks out there in the literature. You might have been familiar with community-based social marketing. It's just one. Patty will be talking about that in the later talk. But there are a lot of different ones like intervention mapping, mind space. But all these, there are 5 main points that these frameworks have in common. And that's first to define the issue in human behavioural terms, to refine and select what your target behaviour is going to be, determine the drivers and the barriers, design the intervention, and then implement it and evaluate. And this is sort of a circular process because you evaluate, you get feedback, and that can feed back into any of those steps, and then you can improve as you go along. So what do I mean by define the issue in human behavioural terms? It's sort of, we need to not just say what is the issue, we need to actually identify specific behaviours that contribute to the issue, and I'm talking human behaviours here, the specific behaviours that are going to resolve the issue, and who actually is going to do these behaviours. So for an example, my PhD, I'm working on domestic cat management, and the issue is usually say, oh, there's too many cats in our neighbourhood, they're killing all the wildlife. But to actually define that issue in human behavioural terms, you have to start thinking about, well, is it because the owners are letting their cats roam free? Is it because the owners don't desex their cats? Is it because people dump unwanted cats? So you can see we flip it a bit and start actually looking at what are the human actions that contribute or can resolve this issue. The next step, because the behavioural literature tells you that the more detailed you can get the behaviour, the more precise your behavioural analysis is going to be. So, you know, I've said, okay, we need to stop owners letting their cats roam. That's a fairly broad behaviour. So we need to get a bit more specific. So, okay, what do we want people to contain their cats? Do they want to contain them inside all the time? Do they want to contain them in their yard? Do we want them to build a structure? But each of those different cases, there's a whole lot of barriers and drivers to get people to do those. And so when you start, you get this multitude of behaviours, and you need to be able to select just a few, because this is the real world. We can't afford to target all our behaviours. And also, if we select a lot of behaviours to try and change at once, people suffer from behaviour fatigue or change fatigue. So the way that you select the target behaviour, Patty will probably go into this in more detail, but you have a look at what's the likelihood that people are going to adopt the behaviour, what's the current penetration, how many people are currently doing that behaviour, and what is the actual impact on the outcome of that behaviour. So when you can take all these into account, you can start narrowing down what target behaviour you want to work on. And once you've decided that, the next step is to determine the drivers and barriers of that behaviour or behaviours. Now this is an often neglected step because, again, in the real world, we're given a bundle of money, we're told to go and do something, we want to get in there and do the intervention. We don't want to take 3 months, 6 months to actually go in and really have a look at what the drivers and the barriers of that behaviour are. And there are some pitfalls, and I just thought I'd like to share some of those with you now. So in my study, I was looking at trying to find out what the drivers and barriers of cat containment were. I did various surveys, and on the sideline I came up with different factors. So there was awareness factor, there was people's capability, there was the opportunities and circumstances there, physical barriers and regulation, and then there was motivational ones. So we've got the lack of motivation, we've got beliefs, people's beliefs, the emotional attachment to the cats, and also social norms. So when I interviewed a room of experts about what they thought was the barriers to cat containment, the most common one that they identified was the physical barriers. So that's things like cost, materials. That's why people don't contain their cats. So if you have a look at most of the ones that field experts identified are external to the person, or something that's easily identified about the individual, because we can't get into people's heads. We might have a bit of personal insight, but we don't know what's going on inside them. So we tend to identify factors that are external and easily identifiable to us. So then I asked people who already contain their cats. As you can see, there's a change towards the more individual factors that they're aware of. And we've also got, this a high emotional thing, I suppose. These people contain their cats. They might get on their high horse a bit and think, people who don't contain their cats don't love their cats like I love my cat. So you get some sort of high difference there. But as you can see, things like the physical barriers and the regulation that our experts identified as very important suddenly aren't important. But then I directly asked other cat owners who don't contain their cats. Now this is the group that you're going to be targeting with your intervention. So these are the people you really should be asking. As you can see, their responses were sort of the same as cat owners in that they're identifying ones that are individual, sort of internal to the individual, but a little bit different to the people who already contain their cats. And I'd just like to point out the social norms. That tends to be one of those automatic factors that affects our behaviour, but we're really not aware of it. And both these, when I asked these people directly, they're not aware of those things happening, so they don't really identify it. So then I did my survey. So by that way, you're sort of not directly asking people, you're using questions, asking them to rank different sort of questions, and that way you can tease out those more automatic ones. So we get a different response again. And as you can see, the one of the main barriers that I found was that the capability of people, they just don't know how to contain their cats, and their beliefs. It's a very strong belief that cats need to roam. It's cruel to lock them up, and also social norms comes into the picture. So when I'm designing my intervention, they're the sort of factors that I'm going to target. They use completely different techniques to what we would have used if I'd gone with the field experts. Okay, so now that we've done our barrier research, we get to design the intervention. So we need to consider a couple of points. You need to have a strong communication strategy. So you need to have specific and engaging messages that reach your audience, and you have to think about things like framing and the language that you use. The second point is the technique that you choose, and it has to be specific to the types of drivers and the barriers that you've identified. You also need to think about an appropriate mode of delivery. You've got face-to-face on one hand, you've got sort of mass delivery on the other hand, to individuals, to groups. They all have their weaknesses and their strengths, but you have to work out particular techniques need a particular mode of delivery. And also, from the education literature, you need to think of the learning style of your audience. Everyone doesn't learn the same way, so you need to have maybe some different things in there so that people can pick up on what your intervention's trying to teach them. And then also, we're in the real world, we need to satisfy feasibility criteria. Is it affordable? Is it practical? Is it cost effective? Acceptable, fair, and it has no adverse side effects. So that's quite a long list of things that you need to consider when you're designing your intervention. And then you get to the next phase, which is implementing and evaluating. Now, it's a good idea to pilot your study because it's much easier to make changes and refine things on a smaller scale. But then when you implement it, it's important that you have built in your evaluation, and you have to make sure that you're actually evaluating behavioural outcomes and not just outputs. So you're not ticking the boxes and saying, I handed out 1,000 leaflets, or we had so many web hits. That's just outputs. It's not actually measuring how many people are out there have changed their outcomes. And it's also important to evaluate the whole process to help you sort of refine your intervention and also inform other interventions. So in summary, there is scope to improve our behavioural effectiveness of our wildlife management interventions. We need to define the issue in human behavioural terms. We need to refine and select those target behaviours so that we can get the most effectiveness out of it that we can. We need to do barrier and benefit research on the target audience. And we need to better design our interventions using the most appropriate techniques for the specific situation. And we need to use targeted communication and delivery strategies. One size does not fit all. And we need to pilot, implement, and most importantly, evaluate. So I just want to give a plug. I'm part of a program in the invasive animal CRC, and we plan to produce a lot of help manuals and publications that can help practitioners go through these steps and help design their interventions. The first one of those is available, the Behavioural Effective Communications for Invasive Animal Management, a practical guide. So you can download that for free from the www.pesmart.org.au. And there's some other publications, if you want to read a bit more about it, that I've got out into the scientific literature. So that's all from me today.
Hello, my name's Patty Please, and I'm part of the behaviour change group in the invasive animal CRC, along with Lynette in that area, and my boss is Professor Don Hine. I'm employed by the CRC and UNE, but I'm based in Brisbane, so I do a lot of work partnering with the Queensland Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, and also with some local councils in Queensland. So, shall I begin the talk? Okay, so today I'm going to talk, following on with Lynette's talk that gave a lot of introduction to some of the broad structures of behavioural science and behaviour change approaches. I'm going to talk specifically today about two projects we've been working on in Queensland on how to apply behavioural science to increase participation in wild dog management. And the two contexts are the peri-urban and the rural landscape. And the IACRC has been leading the project with a local council in southeast Queensland on the peri-urban project, and Petra Scowen of Department of Agriculture and Fisheries in Queensland has been leading in the rural landscapes project. So I'm representing her work as well as ours. We've all been working together, basically taking the lead from, it's a capacity building project as well as, what it does is in its essence, and, led by Professor Don Hine. We're all learning how to use this approach, and Queensland Department of Ag and Fisheries are learning with us, and then they take it out to the rural area, and then they're developing a third project on their own. So there is a strong capacity building element in the work that we're doing up there. There we go. So I'm going to dive into the deep end, as you've had a sort of a lot of introduction to concepts from Lynette. I'm diving in the deep end to introduce you to the core of community-based social marketing, which is the framework, the overarching framework we use. A lot of people get put off by the label. I'd say please try not to be. It's chock-block full of behavioural science and social psychology, a very solid framework. It's been used extensively around the world on environmental issues. It was developed by a Canadian environmental psychologist, Doug Mackenzie Moore, and as I say, has been widely adopted, and we're trying it out in the invasive space. There's 5 very straightforward key steps to this framework, and these will overlap a lot with what Lynette's been talking about. So step 1 is to take the time to define and prioritize your behaviors. And we've spent a lot of time doing this, and it's what most of the rest of this talk is going to be about. But you get that foundational step right, and the rest will start to follow on. Step 2 is then, once you've selected a couple of high priority behaviors from step 1, you then work to uncover the barriers and benefits of these behaviors. Step 3 is then to develop a strategy, or as Lynette was using the word, intervention, and she mentioned a whole range of interventions that can be used. I've just put up a couple there: incentives and communications that will promote the behavior change. Then step 4 is to take the time to pilot the strategy. Don't dive into doing a full broad implementation yet. Pilot it, use an experimental design if you can, and take those findings, evaluate it, and then feed that back into your project before you implement the strategy more broadly. And always good to evaluate again. Okay. So for most of the rest of this talk, I'm just focusing on step 1, which is about prioritizing behaviors. And for both the projects, the peri-urban and the rural, and I'll get to those details in a minute. But at this point, I want to introduce, it's a basic tool for prioritizing behaviors. It's called the Behavior Change Matrix. And basically what you do is you've got a series of columns. In the first column, you'll be listing key behaviors for change that you will have acquired through engaging with key stakeholders and reading through literature. And then what you're wanting to do is to, through surveys or other research means, get data on effectiveness or impact of each of these behaviors, the probability of their adoption in the community. We're using a survey to the community for that. And then the third element is to get some data on current penetration or usage of each behavior. And what you're looking for ultimately is behavior or a couple behaviors that have high effectiveness or impact, whichever word you prefer to use, high probability of adoption, and low current penetration. So that's the generic basis for step 1, to prioritize your behaviors that then facilitates your decision on what few behaviors to choose. So I'm now going to talk about what we actually did in the peri-urban and the wild dog project to populate this matrix in step 1. So after we'd drawn up through a lot of engagement with key stakeholders, scientific experts, local council managers, a whole range of people, we drew up a list of about 15 behaviors for in the peri-urban project. In the rural project, that list of behaviors was drawn up from the work, some work that followed on from what Tanya was talking about, where they went out and did these in-depth interviews. So we ended up with approximately 15 behaviors for each context. And then we sent out to about 10 key stakeholders for each survey. It was like a statement, more than a question. So we've got there like, landholders install ejectors with 1080 toxin on their properties. And we asked the key stakeholders, or experts, whatever word you prefer, to rate the effectiveness of this behavior on a scale from 1 to 10. And we actually asked them to rate it on the basis of economic, environmental, and psychosocial impacts individually, and in the peri-urban environment also public health impacts. So we've got quite a full data set. In the rural sector, For example, a behavior was sheep producers regularly check and maintain predator-proof fencing on their properties. And there's a lot of focus on the fencing in the rural sector that came out of the work that Tanya was talking about. We got these results in and basically took the mean value overall for each behavior. So on the left-hand side of this screen, you've got the data from the peri-urban, from the right-hand side, the rural. And you've got each of the behaviors, and they're listed or ranked according to their effectiveness or how that was rated. In the peri-urban, you've got things like the use of ejectors with cyanide. These are kind of short forms of the behavior statement. Ejectors with 1080, because this is a new technology coming in to be used. Community group invitations to council to talk about wild dog management. Trapping, to not feed dogs, around your property. In the rural behavior, under the rural behaviors, you'll see it's far more context specific, where the top 4 behaviors relate to fencing, collective fencing with sheep producers, or check and maintain fencing. So that's based on key stakeholder assessment, the ranking of the behaviors. Then we sent out a survey to the community. That was the next step. And this is where we wanted to acquire data on the likelihood of adoption and their current penetration or current use. For each behavior that there was, we had 3 questions. And for example, in the peri-urban, a current penetration question would be, during the past 12 months, how often have you reported wild dog sightings and impacts to your local council? And there's a scale of 5 of, how often they would have done that. On the likelihood of adoption, I'll now jump to the rural side. It's like, what is the likelihood that you would get together with your immediate neighbours and fence your properties to a predator-proof standard in the future? And once again, a scale of 5 that they could put a value against. So that was quantitative data. And then we took the opportunity at this stage to acquire some early stage barriers data for them to provide some qualitative data for them to suggest reasons why they think people might not take up these particular behaviors. And we'll be using that data to develop a barriers and benefits survey as part of step 2. So at this point, we're going to leave the example of the rural project, because they're at the stage of just putting out the community survey. So it'll be a couple months before they get that data back. So now we're just looking at peri-urban data and results. And so this is this behavior matrix populated with the data from these 2 surveys. And so you've got the behaviors, the effectiveness ratings, the likelihood of adoption ratings, and the current penetration. And there's a simple equation of the effectiveness value times the likelihood of adoption times the inverse of current penetration. And then you get a value, and you get to, and your behaviors are ranked based on that total value. And you'll see in the peri-urban context, the top 3 were to report sightings and impacts to council, community group invitations to council to talk about wild dog management, and fence and contain small and medium scale animals. I'll just say at this point, we have met with the local council and Department of Ag, and we're looking at doing the first one, reporting sightings and impacts to council, as the main behavior that we will focus on. But for many other reasons, we're also looking at the behavior of the use of ejectors with 1080. Now, you may say, why would we pick one that's down the list? It's not a top priority. First of all, this shows us that it's, on all these criteria, it's not coming out near the top. But there are many other reasons to be, as a new technology, and to get data on that. We might not do a full CBSM project on the ejectors, but we're definitely going out to do a barriers and benefits survey to find out more about that. But our number 1 is that reporting sightings and impacts to council. And this is making the point again that soon there'll be equivalent data rolling in from the Rural Wild Dog Landholder Survey. So sometime down the line, hopefully we can present that to you as well. So a bit to say from the qualitative data, where we asked people about the barriers to each of these behaviours. So this is just an example what we did with that qualitative data, and this is the on the behaviour to do with reporting to council. In the right-hand column, we've got examples of responses that people get. You know, a lot of people are unsure if what they see when they see dogs, if they're wild dogs. They find it difficult to contact the necessary people, don't know who to contact. There were also things about not wanting to see dingoes harmed, don't like to get involved in government. So that's some of the examples. But what we then did was to code up into general themes. So we've got key themes. And then we coded up again into this framework, this behaviour change framework, which is about 3 key predictors of behaviour to do with capability, opportunity, and motivation. And Lynette was talking about a similar framework like that. You've got 3 predictors of behaviour there. So we could take the responses and code them into this behaviour change framework. Now this gives, this isn't all of the behaviours, but put this data up. So it's basically for each behaviour, the number of responses made relating to capability, opportunity, and motivation. On the left-hand side, the 3 columns, those were the top 3 ranked behaviours. Not a lot of comments made, usually kind of across all three, you know, to varying degrees across the 3 predictors of behaviour. Some examples: reporting to council, that concern about who do they report to. When it comes to small and medium fencing, small and medium sized animals, one of the big issues was the cost. But you'll see on the right-hand side where you've got the lethal approaches to management, very high level of responses under the category of motivation. And this actually equates a bit with the stuff that Lynette was talking about with her cat management, where, you know, it's people's values and beliefs that were really marked as major barriers to these behaviours, if these were the ones you wanted to pursue. And under motivation, it's about risk, the risk of these methods to their pets, to the children, to other humans, to their livestock, and to wildlife. So that's a big concern. And some people just put down very strong value statements like this is cruel, or this is barbaric, or this is ... beep beep, let's say. So that's given us a bit of an indication, a taste of some of the barriers that is out there in the community for these behaviours, and we'll be doing further work in that area. So just, there's actually, I suppose, 2 key learnings. The first one is what we've found, and Lynette's work on cat management quite similar, that to include the community and landholders' perspectives along with the key stakeholder perspectives leads to a different results in the behaviour prioritization process. If we were just taking you know, a ranking of behaviours from key stakeholders or experts, it's quite a different level of ranking than if you include the community voice or the community landholder perspectives. And the other key learning is that thing of, whilst you can use this process, you can transfer it across to different contexts, different geographies, different species, you really need to go through the process every time, because it's the content of this process is very, very context specific. So that's about where I'll wrap up for this talk. 2 points. Tanya talked about the community of practice for community engagement and leadership. I facilitate a online Facebook community of practice to do with behaviourally effective communications, which is essentially all this work. So if you're interested in that, you could get in touch with me, and Yeah, happy to take any. Oh, the other thing is a lot of the resources we've been developing, the surveys and things like that, we're sort of refining them and turning them into templates, and we're happy to share those with anybody who's interested in seeing them, using them, adapting them. So everything we do can be, we try to tailor it to be used so that others can use them, learn from them, and adapt them. Thank you for your time.